Okay, everyone, so we're back for the second half of surrealism, where we look at chapter 1930b, and we talk about the dissident group of surrealists that gathered around this guy, Georges Bataille. And he also founded a journal called Document, but the emphasis in Document was much more about ethnography, which is part of the history of anthropology, going out and studying other peoples. In the case of Bataille and these ethnographers, non-Western cultures. So there is something advanced about this enterprise, because now for the first time you have these artists associated with these ethnographers who are not satisfied, and they think it's stupid to simply get an object, look at an object that's been more or less plundered from a colonial situation, put it behind a glass in a museum in Paris, and then study it. Like that, they think that's stupid. They think that's not quite right. So they have a conception of embedded field research, where they said to really understand a culture, you have to be there, and you have to witness, and you have to study them, quote unquote, scientifically. So this is an advance in distinction from the ways in which non-Western cultures were understood before this. Of course, we're still a ways off from someone like Levi-Strauss and then more recent cultural anthropologists who are aware that their very presence in some ways, in many ways, affects the situation of what they're observing, right? And certain biases that you bring to the field, which certainly would be part of these earlier ethnographers. But nonetheless, it is still, at the very least, an advance in the conception of the other. And so Bataille is interested in working with artists and working with ethnographers at this time. And we'll talk more about his theories that influence the artists that gravitate towards him rather than Breton. He's less interested in Freud and more interested in his own theories that can be compatible with Freud in certain ways, but they do diverge from Freud. So this set of surrealists are more indebted to and working through and with Bataille's ideas. So there's another thing we want to talk about. If ethnographers are becoming a little bit more advanced in this moment and not satisfied with just studying objects that have been decontextualized, there's something else that happens to the very term primitivism, one of the terms that we started out with in this semester. And so you'll remember primitivism for artists like Picasso and Matisse, it was like a scary, dark, dangerous thing, right, that they could use in their practice, and it was often tinged, or maybe more than simply tinged, with racist projections on other peoples. Beginning in the 1920s, it will still be a form of appropriation. It will still be a form of often racist tropes, and the idea of primitivism itself will still be there, but it has gone, let's just put it very bluntly, it went mainstream. Primitivism went mainstream. It became chic. It became trendy. So you'll see it in magazines. You could have a field day looking at this spread of different types of dances. Dancing was really popular at this time. Jazz was becoming popular. Jazz was coded as part of, quote unquote, more primitive forms of music. At the time, that was coded that way, at least in Paris. You had someone like Josephine Baker, who became very, very famous, very well known, just a total celebrity, dancing and singing in jazz clubs and that sort of thing. So these are examples of the term primitivism, the idea of primitivism itself going from something that's dangerous to something that's chic. Whether that's an improvement is for you to decide, because of course it still contains, even though now it's safe, it still contains all these problematic associations and ideological constructions, right? And so you also see it in theater. So this is Léger, who we talked about with Purism. He did the set for this large theater, the creation of the world, and he did the costumes for it. So I think you can tell, like, this is really ethno-kitsch pastiche, because it looks like a mix between, quote unquote, like tribal African visual culture and then oceanic Northern Pacific visual culture. So as one of the first readings we had in this class stressed in Gauguin, that primitivism was always this kind of pastiche, this weird mix of lots of different sources, and so you're still seeing that here with Léger. But there's another thing that happens to primitivism at this time, and this will be important for Bataille. So it gets revalued. It's still problematic, but it gets revalued. So it goes from an idea of, at least for psychologists, not in popular culture, which in popular culture it's far more problematic. But for psychologists, the idea of the primitive, quote unquote, it becomes less a sign of degeneracy or deviance, like dark, like all those tropes that we talked about before. But it was more about they focused more on the aspects of it as this evolutionary process, that both humanity went from primitive to more civilized cultures and civilizations. That's all quite problematic. But then also at the level of the human individual, that you go as a baby, you have these quote-unquote primitive drives, and then you get socialized, and then you become cultured, and blah, 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 right? And so the primitive became almost more of a psychological concept of development during this period. And then it could latch itself onto ideas about the origins of art itself, right? Bataille will talk about this. And Bataille will have a conception of the origins of art, of quote-unquote primitive drives, as inherently a drive to destroy. He argues that the very beginnings of art, the impulse either of a child or of humanity itself, the originary impulse of creating, of making art, was the pleasure of destroying, the pleasures of defiling and making dirty. So this is Masson again, and Masson will defect. He's going to go from Breton's group to Bataille's. And you see how now we can talk about it in a different way, right? We had talked about this in the first half of class as a type of self-analysis, of this automatic sort of drawing, where then you can go back and find meaning. For Bataille, he would see this and say, no. This is a drawing that is inherently a form of destruction and of chaos, and going in and just mucking things up and making all sorts of distortions of shapes and that sort of thing, right? It's this pleasure of basically scribbling, right? Think of a child just scribbling something in crayon or doodling, right? It's a process for Bataille that's the pleasure of just going on this clean white page and then just making lots of marks, right? And so Bataille was also interested then in graffiti. And you have a photographer like Brassailles, who's associated with Documents and imaged in Documents. He has a long-running series beginning in the early 30s of the graffiti that he sees around Paris. And so for Brassailles, here's some more. For Brassailles, as for Bataille, this shows you the very origin and impulse of making art. It's not to make something beautiful. It's to go and take this pristine wall and make cuts into it, to make shapes, to defile the cleanliness of the wall, or that cement that's still drying. There's a pleasure, according to Bataille, to go in and just break it up and like put your palm print in it or whatever it is, right? That's his conception of the origins of art, and the way in which, quote-unquote, primitive impulses were being recoded at this period. And so here's another one. It's very clear. Like, this is an image of the human form. Again, the female form is depicted in this sort of, it's kind of a violent depiction of the female form, very quick, very fast, and then like almost cut and incised, going in with all these different scratch marks, right? So the pleasure of defiling, there's almost like a sadistic quality to the origins of art for Bataille. And he was definitely interested in the origins of art. Like, this is not just theories that he's pulling out of his hat. Bataille at the time was one of the experts of prehistoric cave painting. And he noticed, this is an expedition that he was part of, going into the Lascaux caves, which I don't know if you know, but today they're all closed. Like, you can't go because there's too much. With human beings going in there, they bring in the outside air, they bring in dirt, they bring in even their breath can damage these very old, fragile paintings. So these caves like Chauvet and Lascaux caves that are being discovered around this time, they're now closed to the public, but they've digitally recreated them, so you can go and walk and go into like the full-scale recreation of these caves. So Bataille was lucky enough to be on one of these expeditions, and he noticed that prehistoric artists, if we can call them artists, whenever they depicted the human being, it was always in a stick figure. It was always, in some ways, even depictions of like automutilation. There's almost like a masochistic quality to the way in which prehistoric image makers presented the human, whereas animals were lavishly depicted, and the animals in the Lascaux caves are really, really wonderful. And so this brings us to another concept that's important for Bataille, and this is his concept of the informe, which you can translate as formlessness. And this is related to the idea of breaking things up, making things mucky, defiling, debasing things, right? Because one of the ways in which the informe can be defined, as you'll see in a moment, is being attentive to like the gross things in life, the things that are really usually thought to be not even objects of thought, like this stuff you don't even think about, you try not to think about, right? It's just the world is this gross, wormy, mucky sort of place. But Bataille wants to turn that all on its head. He wants to start paying attention to like the more base aspects of life, and this is not simply to be transgressive. He fundamentally thought that human categories, especially let's say science and mathematics, that this is these are human categories that we place on the world, and we think we've understood the world, but in fact we've just thrown a net on it, and it does not correspond with the way the world really is. So this is where he says, this is a famous definition of the informe, of the formless. For academic men to be happy, he's clearly against academic men, the universe would have to take shape. All of philosophy has no other goal. It's a matter of giving a frock coat to what is a mathematical frock coat. So basically what he's saying is that for most of at least human thinking from the Renaissance and definitely the Enlightenment on, we've basically just assumed that our categories, that the way we understand the world through measurement, through taxonomies, through basically scientific categories, that we've fundamentally misrecognized reality. We mistook reality for our own minds and categories, but in fact they don't fit perfectly. And there's a lot left out. Just think of the category of human and animal. Just think of that category. Humans, we are animals. We're part of primates. So where we're on one side, and then on the whole other side, you have every single other animal, from spiders to orangutans to ducks to oysters. Like, it doesn't really help us that much as a binary, as a category, right? This is what Bataille is after. He's saying, like, We need to actually engage the world in the way it is. And for him, it defies our categories. It's this formless place. It's inchoate. And it's way too messy for us to make into this system. So this is what he means by formless. Our categories inherently try to form the world, but he says the world itself, the universe, is something more like a spider or spit. It's something that will exceed our categories and our ability to fully know them. That's what he means by afom. So you can see how it's a big challenge to human knowledge. And then the other part of the afom is that it will work to declassify the world. So if I just talked about classification and categories and how the afom explodes these things, it also declassifies the world in another sense. So like if someone says you're classy, you dress real nice, and you speak like in a classy way or whatever, you have manners, that's like the traditional understanding of the word classy. To declassify the world is to make it is to bring it down, to make it base, to make it lower, to make it like crass and tasteless, and so on and so forth. And Bataille is true to his word. He writes a book called Story of the Eye, which is a book you can't really read in public because it's really pornographic, and it's really transgressive of all sorts of categories, and it's especially sexual categories, especially of male and female. And then someone like Boifard, who's a surrealist photographer, who has a lot of up-close photographs of the human body. This is a mouth that's spitting. This is the big toe. This is the toe on the foot. And Bataille has funny theories about the big toe. He says, like, it's the most human part of us. It's like the thing that allows us to be upright. But it's normally the thing that we think is gross, like this big toe just coming out at us. So this is very much part of the afom. And so if we look at works of surrealist painters and artists that are around Bataille at this time, we start to see these ideas come through in the work themselves. So this is Miro. He's still with Breton at this point. This is 1925. This is The Birth of the World. But it fits really well with what we've been discussing. So not only the origins of art, it's called The Birth of the World, and you have these sort of rudimentary shapes that are foregrounded by this really chaotic, almost like cave, it's like a cave wall, this dank human cave wall, a dank humid cave wall with drippings. It also looks kind of violent or something. Like I think of nuclear fallout or something like that, black rain, these horrible moments in human history, which actually hasn't happened yet in 1925. But you do get the sense that the background is this really inchoate, sort of disordered, indeed informe space, whereas these shapes are just kind of trying to do their best in the foreground, right? This looks like a figure, this looks like a balloon. I'm not quite sure what this quasi Big Dipper thing is here, right? But so these are these biomorphic shapes that Miro is working with. And already in 1925, you seem to have a conception of painting that's more about like less about a dreamscape and more about this kind of inchoate, sort of orderless place, and maybe even foreboding in some ways. By the time Miro defects and becomes part of the document group of Bataille, he'll start saying things like, I want to assassinate painting. And he'll turn his back on painting altogether for a moment and start making these constructions, which are made from trash, which are made from really lowly materials, like wood, and then you have this weird handle. You have no idea what this handle is for. He still has these sort of biomorphic shapes, but now they're more like either attacking themselves. He's like attacking the painting. Look, these are like large staples, like a staple gun kind of thing. Or the painting is actually threatening us and attacking us, where you have in this shape, this round red shape, these nails that are coming out at you. So this painting is actually quite dangerous. So it fits much more with Bataille's theories of creativity as a form of defiling, of dirtying, using trash, and then also of like being destructive, right? And here you have both sadism, You have sadistic qualities, the paint is coming out to hurt you, but also masochistic, where the paint is hurting itself, or at least Miro is hurting painting itself, right? And then you have someone like Giacometti. The book talks, who would also be associated with Bataille. The book talks about this at length as a type of informe sculpture. I've never been totally sold on their reading, but basically the canonical reading of this sculpture is that it's both male and female. There's almost like a bisexual quality to these two objects. I don't know what you think. I'm not going to go into it too much because your book does talk about this work at length in the context of Bataille's informe. But I've never been totally satisfied with that reading. So it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say. Then you had artists that are also associated with surrealism at this time, also associated with the ideas coming out of Bataille, but maybe also still a little bit of Freud here. So someone like Murray Oppenheim, who was a female artist, so she's one of the more prominent women artists as part of the surrealists. She started making these what are called objets trouvés, found objects. So she took these everyday objects, in this case a teacup and a saucer and a spoon, and then she made them strange. She added antelope fur to these objects. This is actually in MoMA, this object. And so it's very simple as a premise, but then it does send us off to all these ideas we've been discussing. So we could talk about this in the context of Bataille. Like, these are two categories, animal and porcelain, that are kind of blending into each other. It's very strange. It's this type of informe. It's hard to categorize. It's also possibly gross, right? To think of drinking from this cup and then putting your lips to dead flesh, right? To dead skin and fur can actually be something that might read or feel as abject to you. But then there's also the uncanny here. So there are also Freud's theories that could work, because Freud would probably say that, well, yeah, this cup is uncanny because it looks like, a cup while you're drinking your tea isn't going to come alive. But all of a sudden, if it's coated with skin and fur, you start thinking that it could become animate, like an animal. So the uncanny works here, as does eroticism and sexuality, which would also be more in like a Freudian domain, but probably also Bataille. So the idea that she's taken this teacup and saucer and sexualized it in certain ways through the fur itself, the fur having connotations of sexuality and the fetish and so on and so forth. So I'd have to spend a lot of time establishing that reading. We'd have to go into Freud's theories of the fetish. So I'm not going to do that because otherwise we'll go way, way too long. But just be aware. Hi, Jax. Just be aware that multiple readings will work on these objets trouvés. And here's another one. It's called My Nurse, and it's very simple again. She's taken two high heels, inverted them, put them on a platter. She bound them in the same way that feet might be bound, but then also in the way that, like, say, a leg of lamb or something like that, a piece of meat would be bound and then cooked, and then you have to handle it. This is quite literally those things in restaurants where the bone is coming out of the flesh of this baby lamb, and then I forget actually what these things are called, but then you don't get your hands dirty, and then you can whatever. People don't get their hands dirty while they're eating this kind of stuff. And so she's taken two things, female feet and shoes, but she's made them uncanny because now they double as like a piece of meat on a platter, right? And this is very interesting because flash forward 50 years and you'll have someone like Carol Adams who writes a book called The Sexual Politics of Meat, where she argues very persuasively that if you look around, especially in advertising, you'll notice that the way meat is sold, the way it's advertised, it often uses the female body. It often uses sex to sell it, right? Even just think of the like cuts of meat or food that's based on meat, how much of it doubles as even derogatory terms for women, like rack, like breast, like thigh, whatever else it might be, like bird, all sorts of different ways in which meat will double as like usually like like sexually explicit terms towards women. And ecofeminists today try to articulate this and show how it works in culture, that the violence of meat may very well be misogynist in certain ways in the way it's sold. Well, Oppenheim is almost doing this well before. Whether she was conscious of this or not is up for debate, and we have to do more research on what she said about her works. But it seems like she's referencing this kind of thing, because here you have high heels, which are normally read as, probably not the most convenient way of walking around. And I've had 3 older sisters, and they've told me that this is not a fun, like these kind of hurt. They're an imposition to have to wear. The fact that it's bound, you get the sense that these are bound feet, and then the fact that it's turned into a cut of meat makes you think that she's conflating these two things, right? So it's interesting, but above all, it's a type of uncanniness here. You also have a number of photographers that are associated with Bataille, and so here you have Man Ray, who was notorious in the things that he said, seemingly like a really violent guy, at least in his mind, which would fit with Bataille's conception of art as this violent enterprise. And he was also, as was Bataille, obsessed with the Minotaur. They even found a journal together called Minotaur. So this is a photograph of a female torso. There's a crease here, but that's not part of the original photograph. This is just from a large book spread. So you have this female torso with the arms up, and then her head is more or less decapitated. Obviously not literally. This is just through the play of light and shadow. And so the female form doubles as this bull's head, right? With the eyes, with the mouth here, or maybe the nose, and then of course the horns. So that's this type of uncanniness, but it's also this formlessness, this aphome. So this cross between bull and human body, which would have been very interesting to Bataille and to Man Ray. And then just the idea of, the myth of the Minotaur himself, this half man, half bull creature who's in a cave waiting to devour someone that comes in, the sort of violent subterranean kind of story. Bataille would have loved with this, and it would go well with his theories. And then we also have Broussaille. Notice how often the female body has been invoked in surrealism. So it's definitely used in all sorts of ways in the visual production of the surrealists, oftentimes in objectifying ways. So here's another one called Nude. And it's often pointed out that if this photograph is read as aphome in some ways, it's like a formlessness, unclassifiable image. It's usually at the level of gender or sex, because it's clearly a female body, like female form, but then the whole thing seems to double, and I'm sorry you can't unsee it once I say this. I'm not a huge fan of this reading, but I guess it can be kind of compelling. Her body actually becomes like a large phallus. So then this is the shaft, and then this is her behind basically becomes the head of the phallus here. So the surrealists would have probably loved this doubling of the female form and the male sex organ. And so let's end with Calois and mimicry, because these are just such fascinating theories. Calois was one of these guys. He was more of a scientist who was writing in documents, and he's writing a lot about animals. He's kind of an early ethologist in a way, and he was fascinated in mimicry. So the way in which some animals, they will mimic the outside world, they'll look like something else, as a way of warding off natural predators. Right? So the surrealists in Kalawa, they love this because this looked like an uncanny moment in nature. It's even like a form of informe, where this caterpillar becomes this other creature with these large eyes. These are not eyes; these are natural patterns that make him look, at least to us, he's like this cute caterpillar, right? But maybe for a natural predator, these eyes become somehow threatening or scary, and they'll actually be protective, right? So Kalawa was super fascinated in this form of mimicry. He was also obsessed with the praying mantis. He wrote a whole separate essay just on the praying mantis. And the mantis is interesting because it's also thought that there's a form of mimicry that happens in the praying mantis. When they stand still, they look like a blade of grass. So it's this informe undecidability between insect and grass. But then there's also the really famous stories of sexual cannibalism, which the surrealists loved. So the idea was that female praying mantises, when they're copulating with a male praying mantis, when they're getting their eggs fertilized, they will bite off the head of the male. And one of the theories is that it makes the male kind of, obviously the body start to like shake and panic and what have you, which then will cause fertilization to be more fruitful. And so this feeds into like this femme fatale understanding of femaleness that especially someone like Man Ray was into, the dangerous woman that could be projected onto the praying mantis. There's also the idea that the praying mantis will play dead, like I said before, and even after praying mantis has had its head cut off, it will still, like in death, it will still do some things. It will still like function. So the surrealists love this because if this is not uncanny, like the Walking Dead of the insect world, I don't know what is. And so this was just a fascinating creature for the surrealists. There have been studies, like more contemporary studies on the praying mantis, and one of them, I haven't read a lot of this research, but it seems that the sexual cannibalism is something that's likely more induced by the experimental conditions themselves in the laboratory. That in nature it happens less. Although it does happen in nature, especially when female praying mantises are undernourished, and they need a food source. So their husbands become their partners become their food source. So the non-human world is a very interesting one, and oftentimes different from ours, which the surrealists loved. And then, so let's just end here. I also wanted to talk about film, because film was so important for the surrealists, and this is where we get back to Dali and Buñuel. Buñuel is a Spanish filmmaker, and they collaborated on this one. It's probably the most famous surrealist film. It's called Un Chien Andalou, an Andalusian dog. I'm not going to really say much about it because I'm giving you a video by A.O.C. Scott, who's the film critic of the New York Times, and he's kind of retrospectively covering it. So he talks about and shows you certain scenes, and that's it's the scenes that I want you to see. And so we'll just leave it there. I'll play you this video and then stop. This will be my signing off, talk to you next time kind of thing. Though I do want to plug one film. There's a later film when Buñuel is living in Mexico. He directs a film called Exterminating Angel. It's one of his most famous films, and it's a classic. It's fantastic. It's also I'll leave it there because I don't want to spoil anything. But so if you're interested in surrealist film, check out Exterminating Angel. It's quite good. It's in Spanish. It's filmed in Mexico. It's quite good. So I'll talk to you next time. Just enjoy this very brief overview of Un Chien Andalou and surrealist film. Take care, everybody.
Once upon a time, a long time ago, a couple of crazy Spaniards got together and made a short film. Their names were Salvador Dali and Luis Buñuel, and the film was called Un Chien Andalou, which means, in French, an Andalusian dog. But this movie is not about a dog, it's about 15 minutes of random and sometimes shocking images. Un Chien Andalou is a touchstone of the surrealist movement, an artistic tendency that rebelled against conventional notions of order, beauty, and coherence. And even now, 80 years later, it still seethes with creative, revolting energy. The images are startling and reflect the surrealist obsession with sex, religion, and the Freudian unconscious, all of which may amount to the same thing. But given the near ubiquity of Salvador Dali posters on dorm room walls, modern viewers may find these images somewhat familiar. The real innovation of Un Chien Andalou lies not in the images themselves, but in the radical way that they're strung together. Buñuel was among the first to discover that the language of cinema could proceed beyond the boundaries of sense and produce powerful and strange effects and emotions. The logic of Un Chien Andalou is the logic of dreams. At the time it was made, Un Chien Andalou may have shown more affinities with poetry and painting, photography, and other arts than with film. But in the decades since, movies have absorbed its influence and made up the distance. The syntax that Buñuel employs has migrated from experimental film to music videos and even to Hollywood blockbusters. To watch it now, more than 80 years after it was made, is to see all of those possibilities and some as yet undreamed of opening up again and again and again for the very first time. This is an old dog with an endless supply of new tricks.
Okay, I'm sorry, I will chime in real quick at the end here, just because there was this wonderful moment where on the screen, the female actress in Chien Andalou screamed, and then my cat meowed at the exact same time, which I thought was a fitting moment of objective chance. Two things happening at the same time. This weird uncanniness wasn't planned, unless my cat planned it. Take care, everybody.